Six relatives are riding in a limousine to a funeral in Bartlett, Tennessee when the vehicle entered a railroad crossing. A train struck the limousine and pushed it more than 100 feet along the tracks. Emergency crews removed the passengers and transported several of them to hospitals. Meanwhile, the rest of the family was waiting at the funeral wondering why the deceased person's children had not arrived. They eventually learned that the relatives expected to sit in the front row would become patients in a separate emergency. Hundreds of mourners gathered at Andrew Jackson's Tennessee home in 1845 to pay their final respects to the former president. As the funeral service began, Jackson's pet parrot Powell started loudly repeating profanity it had apparently learned from its owner over the years. The bird became so destructive that the guests could no longer hear the minister. According to the Reverend, Powell was eventually removed from the funeral so the service could continue. The minister struggled to continue while the parrot enthusiastically demonstrated everything they learned from Andrew Jackson. Mourners gathered at an Indiana cemetery in 1901 for the burial of a child. As the casket was being lowered, thousands of bees suddenly descended on the graveside service. The insects attacked the mourners and forced everyone to abandon the cemetery before the burial could be completed. Nobody returned until after dark when workers were finally able to fill the grave without being surrounded by the swarm. The family had planned a quiet final goodbye. The local bee population apparently believed the cemetery had scheduled an outdoor public meeting. Relatives of 24-year-old Corey Ward Jr. gathered at Glenwood Cemetery in Washington for his burial. Two cemetery employees began lowering his glass casket into a concrete vault when the cable snapped. The casket dropped, struck the vault, and suffered visible damage. Family members said Ward's head was also injured during the fall. The burial stopped while relatives confronted workers and recorded the damaged casket. It's difficult to make a burial more traumatic. Dropping the casket is one way to do it. Family and friends gathered in Guyana to carry a loved one to the cemetery as pallbearers lifted the casket for the final walk. Halfway through the procession, the bottom of the wooden casket suddenly gave way. The deceased fell onto the grassy roadside while stunned mourners rushed forward to help the pallbearers lift the casket back together. The funeral was supposed to provide one final moment of dignity. Gravity had other plans. Terry and Janet Shepard purchased neighboring mausoleum spaces in Ohio so they could eventually rest beside Terry's parents. After Terry's funeral, the family received a call saying his casket would not fit in the space that they had owned since 1993. The cemetery report had suggested returning his remains to the funeral home and transferring him into a smaller casket. The family refused, leaving Terry in the space intended for his wife while they searched for another solution. They planned their resting places decades early. The cemetery discovered the measurements after the funeral. A California father visited a San Jose funeral home after the death of his son. Before leaving, the funeral director handed him a bag supposedly containing the clothing his son had worn. When the father opened it at home, he discovered human tissue that a lawsuit identifies as his son's brain. The family then learned that he had allegedly been buried without the organ returned to his body. His father went to collect a few personal belongings. The funeral home sent him home carrying something no parent should ever have been forced to identify. A Houston family visited a mausoleum while preparing to bury their father beside their mother. When they reached her crypt, they discovered dark stains running from the space containing her casket. The family alleges her remains had leaked because the casket was not properly sealed before she was entombed nearly 10 years earlier. Instead of focusing on their father's burial, relatives were forced to confront what had happened to their mother. They arrived at the cemetery expecting to place their parents together. They discovered one burial had failed a decade ago. Tamisha Beauchamp's family was told that the 20-year-old Michigan woman had died after paramedics spent 30 minutes trying to revive her. Her body was sealed inside a bag and transported to a Detroit funeral home. Nearly 3 hours after she was declared dead, an employee opened the bag to begin embalming and found Tamisha staring at him and breathing. She was rushed to a hospital in critical condition while her family demanded answers. The funeral home prepared to receive a deceased woman. Instead, its employee became the first person to realize she was still alive. Mourners were attending a funeral in Columbia, Tennessee, when an intoxicated woman entered the service without being invited. Witnesses said she approached the open casket and began grabbing the deceased man's body while relatives tried to stop her. Police said she also struck one mourner before leaving in a truck, hitting two vehicles and fleeing both collisions. Officers arrested her after tracking her down nearby. The family had prepared for difficult emotions during the viewing. They had not prepared to defend the casket from a stranger who arrived with three separate criminal allegations. A woman's remains were being transported through Decatur, Alabama toward a crematorium when the specialized cardboard container holding her body fell from the hearse near Decatur Mall. The remains landed on busy Beltline Road while passing drivers stopped, took photographs, and posted images online. Her family learned what happened only after the pictures began circulating on social media. They later sued the funeral business responsible for the transport. The family expected her final journey to remain private, complete strangers documented before anyone bothered to call them. Family and friends gathered in Honduras to bury 16-year-old Nancy Perez after doctors declared her dead following a sudden collapse. The next morning, cemetery workers reported hearing screams and frantic banging coming from inside her concrete tomb. Relatives rushed back, broke open the crypt, and found Nancy inside her coffin. She had smashed a glass viewing window, and her fingertips and forehead were badly bruised. Her family believed they had already said their final goodbye. The evidence inside the coffin suggested she had been fighting to come home. Employees at a crematory in Cincinnati, Ohio were carrying out a routine cremation when the process suddenly took an unexpected turn. According to the owner, the deceased was exceptionally large, causing excess body fat to ignite inside the cremation chamber. The intense heat spread to one of the cremation containers, starting a fire that triggered an emergency response from firefighters. Crews brought the blaze under control before it spread further throughout the building, and no one was injured. That is one way to exceed the manufacturer's recommendations. Mourners were attending a graveside funeral near Willard, Missouri when a thunderstorm moved over the cemetery. Several people took shelter beneath a tree as rain began falling. Lightning struck the tree and traveled through the group gathered beneath it. Two mourners died at the cemetery while an elderly couple suffered critical injuries while transported for treatment. The funeral had already brought everyone together because of one death. A single lightning strike left the group grieving several more before they could finish the burial. Friends and family gathered at Harvest Baptist Church in Orlando, Florida to say goodbye to a loved one during an open casket funeral. Without warning, a man who had not been invited walked into the church, approached the casket, and began punching the deceased. Shocked mourners rushed forward to pull him away while others called 911. Police arrested the man inside the church, but investigators never identified a clear motive for the attack. There went that peaceful farewell. 7-year-old Maya Murmu was collecting water in Odisha, India when she was attacked by a wild elephant. She later died from her injuries and her family gathered to cremate her according to local tradition. As mourners stood around the funeral, an elephant believed to be the same one suddenly charged into the ceremony. It grabbed Maya's body, trampled it again, and threw it aside before wandering away, apparently attacking her once and had not provided the elephant with enough closure. Family and friends gathered in Atlanta, Georgia to bury 33-year-old Christina Gilbert, expecting a simple graveside service. Instead, they arrived to find the grave still unfinished and beer on the burial site. Relatives said one of the cemetery workers appeared to have been drinking while digging the grave, forcing the family to remove him and finish the job themselves. The burial was delayed for hours before Christina could be laid to rest. The family came prepared to bury their loved one. They never expected to grab a shovel first.